You walk out into the garden, and at first, everything looks perfect.
The tomato plants are tall and green. The pepper plants are covered in healthy leaves. The cucumber vines seem strong and full of life. But then you start looking closer, and something feels wrong. There are very few tomatoes forming. The peppers keep flowering, but almost nothing develops. The cucumbers grow plenty of leaves, but hardly any fruit. And suddenly you realize that despite all that growth, your harvest is nowhere near what it should be. I have seen this happen more times than I can count, and for years I made the exact same mistake myself. I thought healthy plants automatically meant a big harvest. I believed that if the leaves were green and the stems looked strong, then the vegetables would naturally follow. But that is not how these plants work. In fact, some of the healthiest-looking plants in the garden can be the biggest disappointments when harvest season arrives. What makes it even more frustrating is that most gardeners respond by adding more fertilizer. They water more often. They spend money on products that promise bigger yields. Yet the problem continues because the real cause is hiding in plain sight. I remember one summer when my tomato plants looked better than they ever had before. They were taller than me and covered half the garden. Neighbors kept stopping to admire them. But when it came time to pick tomatoes, I barely filled a basket. All that growth and almost no reward. That was the year an older gardener showed me something that completely changed the way I grow tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. It was not expensive. It was not complicated. And it was not something you would find on the front of a fertilizer bag. Once I understood it, my harvests changed dramatically. The interesting thing is that most gardeners are making this mistake right now without even realizing it. The plants look healthy, so they assume everything is fine. Meanwhile, the harvest keeps shrinking. In this video, I am going to show you exactly why this happens and the simple old-fashioned methods that can turn those beautiful green plants into productive plants again. And the first reason surprises almost everyone because it looks like a sign of success when in reality it is often the beginning of the problem.
The first thing that surprised me when I learned it was this.
A plant can be growing beautifully and still be putting almost all of its energy into the wrong job. Most gardeners see lots of leaves and assume they are on their way to a huge harvest. I used to think exactly the same thing. The problem is that tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers have two completely different goals. One goal is growing stems and leaves. The other goal is producing fruit. And sometimes those two goals fight against each other. I remember looking at one pepper plant years ago that was absolutely covered with dark green leaves. It looked like the healthiest plant in the garden. But at the end of the season, I harvested only a handful of peppers. Right beside it was another plant that looked smaller and less impressive. Yet that one produced nearly 3 times as many peppers. That was the moment I realized I had been judging my garden the wrong way. Most of us accidentally encourage leaf growth instead of fruit production. We give extra fertilizer because we think more food means more vegetables. We water heavily because we think bigger plants must need more water. The result is often a plant that becomes comfortable. It keeps growing leaves because conditions are so easy that it sees no reason to focus on reproduction. In simple terms, the plant becomes lazy. An old gardener explained it to me this way. He said if a tomato plant has everything it wants all the time, it often spends its energy building itself instead of building fruit. That sounded strange back then, but after watching my own garden for years, I found it was true. One of the biggest mistakes happens when gardeners keep feeding nitrogen all season long. The plants respond by producing beautiful green growth. Friends and neighbors admire them. Everything looks successful from a distance. But when you walk closer, you notice fewer flowers and fewer developing fruits. The garden looks impressive, but the baskets stay empty. The frustrating part is that most people do not notice this until late summer when there is very little time left to correct it. That is why understanding what your plants are actually trying to do is so important. And once you see the next sign that your plants are focusing on leaves instead of harvest, you can fix it before losing weeks of production. That next sign is something I now check every single morning when I walk through my garden.
For me, the next breakthrough came from something so simple that I almost ignored it.
I stopped looking at the leaves and started paying attention to the flowers. Most gardeners spend all their time checking plant size. They measure growth by height and by how green everything looks. But fruit always begins with flowers. If the flowers are not staying on the plant, then the harvest is already slipping away. Years ago, I had cucumber vines climbing a trellis that looked incredible. They were thick and healthy and spreading in every direction. Every few days, I would notice new yellow flowers appearing. I thought a huge harvest was coming. Then I started noticing something strange. The flowers would open, and a few days later many of them would simply fall off. No cucumbers, no fruit, just flowers dropping to the ground. The same thing was happening on my peppers. The plants were covered in blooms, but somehow very few peppers were forming. At first I blamed the weather. Then I blamed the seeds. Then I blamed myself. But the real reason was much simpler. The plants were not getting properly pollinated. This is something many gardeners over 50 remember from years ago without even thinking about it. Back then, there were bees everywhere. You could hear them moving from flower to flower all day long. Today, in many areas, there are fewer pollinators visiting the garden than there used to be. And when pollination is poor, the plants can look perfectly healthy while producing very little. I learned an old trick from a gardener who had been growing vegetables longer than I had been alive. Every morning when the flowers were open, he would gently shake his tomato cages and lightly tap the stems of his pepper plants. That was it. No expensive product, no complicated equipment, just a few seconds of attention. The vibration helped move pollen where it needed to go. For cucumbers, he would sometimes use a small paintbrush and gently touch the flowers. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but the difference surprised me. Within weeks, I noticed more flowers staying on the plants. More tiny fruits began forming. The harvest started growing without spending a single extra dollar. Most people never think about this because they assume nature handles everything automatically. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it needs a little help. And there is another mistake that quietly reduces fruit production, even when pollination is working perfectly. Most gardeners make it during the hottest part of summer without realizing it.
One summer taught me a lesson I never forgot.
My tomatoes were growing fast. The peppers looked strong. The cucumber vines were covering every bit of space I gave them. Everything seemed perfect until a stretch of very hot weather arrived. A week later, I started noticing fewer new fruits. The plants were still green. The leaves looked healthy. Nothing appeared sick. Yet production slowed down almost overnight. At first, I thought they needed more fertilizer. Then I thought they needed more water. The truth was neither. The real problem was stress. This is something many gardeners overlook because stress does not always look dramatic. A plant can appear healthy while quietly shutting down fruit production. Tomatoes are especially known for this. When temperatures become too high, the flowers may not set fruit properly. Peppers can drop blossoms. Cucumbers can slow production even while their vines continue growing. From a distance, everything looks fine. Up close, the harvest is disappearing. That was when an older gardener showed me a simple method that costs almost nothing. He said most people focus on feeding the plant but forget to protect the roots. His solution was mulch. Not fancy mulch. Not expensive bags from a garden center. Just grass clippings that had dried for a day or two. Sometimes shredded leaves. Sometimes straw. He spread a layer around the plants and let nature do the rest. The difference was remarkable. The soil stayed cooler. Moisture stayed in the ground longer. The roots experienced less stress during hot afternoons. Within a few weeks, I noticed more flowers staying on the plants and more fruit beginning to develop. Most gardeners still do not do this consistently. They spend money on fertilizers while leaving the soil exposed to direct sun all day. The roots bake while the leaves continue looking healthy. The plant survives, but fruit production suffers. Another small thing I learned was to water deeply instead of constantly. Many people give their plants a little water every day. I used to do the same. The result is shallow roots that struggle when real heat arrives. Deep watering encourages stronger roots that can handle stress much better. Less stress usually means more fruit. But there's another hidden mistake that causes even bigger losses. In fact, it is one of the most common reasons healthy tomato pepper and cucumber plants fail to produce heavily. And it has nothing to do with fertilizer water or even pollination. It happens because gardeners are often afraid to remove something that should never have stayed on the plant in the first place.
One of the hardest lessons I learned as a gardener was that sometimes growing more means removing more.
That sounds backwards, but it is absolutely true. Many years ago, I had tomato plants that looked like small trees. They were covered with branches and leaves. Every week they seemed bigger than before. I was proud of them. Then harvest season came and the results were disappointing. I had all that growth but far fewer tomatoes than expected. The same thing happened with peppers and cucumbers in different ways. The plants were spending too much energy supporting growth that was no longer helping produce food. An older gardener noticed what was happening and showed me something I still do every year. He walked over to my tomato plants and started removing suckers. At first I nearly stopped him because it felt wrong. The plants looked healthy. Why remove healthy growth? But he explained that not every branch helps the plant. Some branches simply compete for energy. They take water and nutrients but contribute very little to fruit production. Once I started removing unnecessary growth, the plants became more productive. The energy was redirected toward flowers and developing fruit instead of endless leaves. Peppers can have a similar problem. Sometimes the center of the plant becomes crowded with leaves that block airflow and sunlight. The plant stays green, but fruit development slows. Removing a few carefully chosen leaves allows more light and air into the plant. Nothing drastic, just enough to help the plant focus its energy where it matters most. Cucumbers taught me another version of the same lesson. When vines become tangled and overcrowded, they spend enormous energy maintaining growth. Many gardeners are afraid to trim anything because they think more vines automatically mean more cucumbers. That is not always true. A cleaner and more open plant often produces better than a giant, tangled one. Most people never realize how much energy their plants waste. They see extra growth and assume it must be helping. In reality, some of that growth is quietly stealing resources from the fruit they actually want. This is why I now spend a few minutes each week simply observing. I look for overcrowded areas. I look for leaves that block airflow. I look for growth that serves the plant less than it once did. It costs nothing. It takes very little time. Yet the results can be surprisingly noticeable. But there is one final mistake that can limit harvests even when everything else is done correctly. And once I discovered it, my tomato pepper and cucumber harvests became far more consistent from year to year.
The final piece of the puzzle took me the longest to understand, because it was not something I could see immediately.
It was about patience and timing. Most gardeners focus on what they are doing today and forget that the plant is always responding to what happened days or even weeks ago. I learned this after a season when I tried everything. I improved pollination. I mulched heavily. I watered properly. I trimmed overcrowded growth. Yet for a while the harvest still seemed slow. Then something interesting happened. Almost all at once the plants started producing far more fruit than before. That was when I realized healthy harvests are often the result of consistent habits rather than quick fixes. Many people make a change and expect results the next morning. Plants do not work that way. Tomatoes need time to develop flowers into fruit. Peppers need time to turn blossoms into peppers. Cucumbers need time to build strong vines before they can support heavy production. When gardeners become impatient, they often create new problems. They add more fertilizer. They water more frequently. They keep changing methods every few days. The plants never get a chance to settle into a productive rhythm. One forgotten habit that helped me tremendously was harvesting regularly. This sounds simple, but many gardeners leave ripe vegetables on the plant too long. The plant sees mature fruit and begins slowing down because it feels its job is already done. Regular harvesting sends a different message. It encourages the plant to continue producing. I notice this especially with cucumbers and peppers. The more consistently I pick them, the more new fruits seem to appear. Another old gardener once told me that a productive garden likes attention. Not expensive products, not constant work, just attention. A few minutes each morning can reveal things that would otherwise be missed. You notice flowers forming. You notice fruits developing. You notice stress before it becomes a problem. Those small observations often prevent larger issues later. Looking back now, I realize that many of my disappointing harvests were not caused by one big mistake. They were caused by several small mistakes working together. Each one quietly reduced production until the season ended with far fewer vegetables than the plants were capable of producing. The good news is that simple changes can reverse that trend surprisingly quickly. And once you see the difference, it becomes very difficult to go back to the old way of gardening. Because the transformation that follows is exactly what every gardener hopes to see when harvest season finally arrives.
At the end of the season, the difference becomes impossible to ignore.
The gardeners who focus only on green growth often stand in front of beautiful plants wondering where all the vegetables went. Meanwhile, the gardeners who understand these simple principles walk out with baskets that seem to refill every few days. The interesting thing is that none of the methods we talked about are expensive. They do not require special products. They do not require complicated systems. Most of them come from habits that gardeners have been using for generations. Paying attention to flowers instead of only leaves, helping with pollination when needed, protecting roots from heat, watering deeply instead of constantly, removing growth that steals energy, harvesting regularly, staying patient and letting the plant do its work. These small actions often create the biggest difference. I still remember the first season when everything finally came together for me. My tomato plants were loaded with fruit from top to bottom. The pepper plants were carrying more peppers than I had ever seen on them before. The cucumber vines kept producing long after I expected them to slow down. For the first time, I felt like I understood what the plants had been trying to tell me all those years. They were never asking for more products. Most of the time, they were asking for better attention. That lesson saved me money and gave me larger harvests at the same time. And that is one reason I enjoy sharing these old methods so much. They are simple enough for anyone to use, and they work whether your garden is large or small. If your tomatoes, peppers, or cucumbers look healthy but are not producing the way they should, do not give up on them. Start looking beyond the leaves. Watch the flowers. Watch the fruit set. Watch how the plant responds to the conditions around it. Very often the answer is already there, waiting to be noticed. Once you make a few small adjustments, you may be surprised how quickly things change. And when those plants finally start producing the way they were meant to produce, there is a special kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing you solved the problem without spending a fortune. The best part is that this is only the beginning, because there is another forgotten mistake that quietly cuts vegetable harvests in half every summer. Most gardeners never notice it until it is too late. And once you see it, you will never look at your garden the same way again.